Why doesn't Halo take off his mask? Who is the mysterious Sheik? And why can't Metroid crawl? These are, of course, some of gaming's biggest questions, with Metroid perhaps being the most mysterious of them all. Maybe we'd know more if they'd make more damn games, am I right, fellas? So let's start this Metroid review off the right way, with the intro of the game. What an idea. I think before we talk about Metroid Prime, it's important to contextualize just how impressive the leap to Metroid Prime on the GameCube truly was. The last Metroid game before Metroid Prime was Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo. So just to be entirely clear, we went from this to this. And the only thing in between was, this.
Failure.
The jump from Super Metroid to Prime is one of the biggest leaps in video games of all time. Up there with Prince of Persia, Bionic Commando, and, Duke Nukem.
Shit.
Not only were we going from 16 bits to, well, we just stopped counting the bits, but I think it's important to remember that when Prime came out, it was one of the most visually impressive games, period. Bar none. And we'll talk more about the presentation of Prime Remastered later, but I still think the original Prime holds up surprisingly well. The art direction catered to the limits of the GameCube perfectly, and the cherry on top of all this context to remember is Nintendo rarely publishes, quote, realistic visuals on their hardware, and while I personally prefer Nintendo's silliness, it is refreshing to see what first-party software and first-party hardware could push in harmony in terms of realism. And Prime delivered then, and simply put, it delivers now. Don't worry, we'll get into that delivery right after you hit subscribe and we finish up this intro section. And I've talked about this in past reviews, but I absolutely love introductions. I'm a sucker for them. When they hit, oh boy do they hit. They suck me in, they set the vibe, and they show what's possible for the material that you're about to absorb. I'm talking about album intros, like the end off the Black Parade. It's melancholic, a microcosm of the album, and it transitions effortlessly into track 2 Dead. Disloyal Order of Water Buffaloes from Fully Ado. Actually, all of Fall Out Boy intros bang, but this will be less a Metroid video and more a Fall Out Boy video if I talk about them all. And to get off this emo kick, let's go with Dance Yourself Clean from This Is Happening. I've listened to this about once a day for the past 3 months. I find myself stuck listening to album openers more frequently than I'd like to admit. I love the opening shots to movies. Hereditary's Dollhouse Mindfuck, Harold and Maude's tone-setting Suicide, and Victoria. This is a joke, because the movie's one shot. I love video game intros. Mass Effect 2's explosive introduction tells you this ain't your grandma's Mass Effect. Majora's Mask raises more questions than it answers, and Metroid Prime sets the bar for atmosphere and presentation, which we'll talk about more in the presentation section. You guys do know that this video is timestamped, yeah? I played this intro a lot as a kid. In fact, this is probably tied with Resident Evil 4 for my favorite intro of the GameCube era. And don't worry, the Resident Evil 4 review will have a whole spiel about that intro. So be sure to get subscribed for that. And seriously, hitting that like and commenting literally anything is a massive help for me.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I loved this intro so much, Nintendo Power offered a bonus disc for subscribing containing the Metroid Prime 2 intro. I already had Nintendo Power. I subscribed again for that demo of that game's intro. I never bought the game, but I did play that intro a hell of a lot. Prime's intro sees Samus investigating a space pirate research facility, learning its secrets before the facility is destroyed. Metroid Prime's intro succeeds in every way a video game intro can. It's a vertical slice of content and self-contained. It shows you abilities you'll get later in the game, getting you comfortable with what you'll lose, so when you lose it, it actually matters, and making you comfortable with those abilities when you do get them. And it makes you feel tangibly weaker when they are ultimately taken away. Prime's intro teaches you how to play the game. You shoot, aim, scan, lock on, strafe, fight bosses, and solve puzzles. Everything a new bounty hunter needs to know how to do. Prime's intro sets the tone. It's isolated and uninformed. In Prime's intro, primes you on the story. But I think a few things really set Prime's intro apart from other intros. The contained space of the research facility not only calls back to Super Metroid as a direct comparison on how far games have come. I mean, you're in a self-isolated facility, which leads to a boss, which leads to a self-destruct sequence. Pretty parallel there, but it also hides the true reveal of the scale and scope of Talon 4 Fallout 3 style. Prime's intro puts the presentation and atmosphere on full display. Where there are dying humans in Super Metroid, there are dying space pirates in Prime. The setting is pretty close to horror from music to visuals, and of course, those visuals, which we are going to be talking about very shortly. And finally, all that horror and tension ratchets into a boss battle, followed by an escape sequence and a crash onto Talon 4. Pacing is where Prime's vertical slice truly succeeds, and once you're let loose onto the planet, the developers can no longer control and direct the player experience with such precision, so it's important that they nailed it while they had the chance. This was Retro's time to really punch the player with linear, atmospheric gameplay, and they 100% nailed it. And now the moment you've all been waiting for. I genuinely think that what keeps Metroid Prime on top of mind for best game of all time is the presentation. Let's start with the elephant in the room, the graphics for Prime Remastered on Switch. Resolution aside, this game looks modern, and this is running on like a 2015 phone chip. The lighting and materials particularly shine. In preparation for the Resident Evil 4 remake review, I've been trying to get the demo to run on my Steam Deck, and let's just say while Resident Evil 4 Remake employs much more sophisticated technologies like real-time ray tracing, which will certainly be turned off on the deck, modern rendering techniques force a relatively blurry image compared to Prime Remastered on the Nintendo Switch's 2015 phone chip. It just goes to show the power of developing for a specific set of hardware. And this was true of the original Prime as well. Even the original game holds up well in my book, rendered at a higher resolution. The key is the art direction, which has carried itself through to the Switch remake. I mean, seriously, you could have told me this was a PS4 game and I totally would have believed you, but there is so much more than graphics to the presentation. I really feel like Prime was integral to the atmosphere and lore building in Demon Souls and, well, the Soulsborne series as a whole. Prime's environmental storytelling combined with its scanning was top of its class at its time. Scanning the environment is analogous to those lore-dense weapon descriptions, and there is so much history drenched in Talon 4. It tells a story of the far past, the long-lost Chozo telling their story of a meteor impact and the devastation it caused to the organic life on the planet. And the exact present. Wait, is that the frigate Orphan from the intro? That's the intro ship, and now it's down here, and now it's a level. That's amazing. Yep, after the space pirate research facility crashes, it becomes not just a landmark, but a re-explorable area. It's stuff like this which truly sets Prime apart, and even, well, wait a minute. I guess Metroid really was ahead of its time. Metroid has borrowed plenty from IP like Alien, but a lesser known Easter egg is the sound played when you save the game. Part of this sound is sampled from the movie Walkabout. And I'm not here to do a full Walkabout review, but I do think that there are some uncanny parallels between the movie the sound designer decided to sample and Metroid. Walkabout largely revolves around two Australian children forced into a survival situation in the outback, and I think there is something mirroring Samus, alone on an alien planet, surviving in a hostile environment, and a strange connection to the natives. Was this Samus's Walkabout? This is a roundabout way of me saying the sound designers knew what they were doing, and Metroid Prime's soundtrack absolutely slaps. A perfect harmony of throwbacks where appropriate, talking about landing on Talon 4 for example, and new beats which blend futuristic with isolation perfectly in much the way the sound designers of Walkabout managed. And there's so many other slight details with the presentation of this game. Like how once you find the space pirates on Talon 4, they start showing up in areas you've previously been to because they're now alerted to your presence. Because they are, beefing up security, and how scans specifically reference Samus and her infiltration. Your actions in the game have a tangible effect on the world, crashing a research facility into a planet, being discovered by space pirates. There is a balance of story unfolding before you arrive and the story you, the player, forge for yourself. And in a way, I still feel like Prime surpasses the Souls games in some respects, where Souls seeps in ancient lore and cause and effect of your actions are relatively unseen. And don't get me wrong, it does happen. Killing Radahn causes a massive hole to open up into the overworld in Elden Ring, but it's more rare, and Metroid simply nails it, years before Demon Souls picked up the torch. And not to belittle other video game series, but Prime so perfectly knocks the presentation out of the park. From music to graphics to environmental storytelling, it all blends together masterfully. So this is going to be an interesting section. I think Prime Remastered puts itself in a unique critical position. We know that Prime 4 is on the way. We can directly look at Samus's first 3D adventure with these new controls and a new coat of paint, and think about what can maybe or should be done differently for Prime 4. And we can do a little bit of self-reflection on Prime along the way. I guess what I'm trying to say is this may seem like I'm being very critical of what is widely considered to be one of the best games of all time, and if the prior two sections are anything to go by, I am certainly in that crowd. But, well, we may as well learn a bit from our past and a bit from the present to look towards the future, that being Metroid Prime 4. So let's start with the present. Prime Remastered has some new controls, and I'll be the first to admit, I was very skeptical about Prime ditching tank controls. Now, please don't kink shame, but I think I may have a bit of a tank control fetish, considering Resident Evil 4 and Metroid Prime are some of my favorite GameCube games, and part of what I like about them are specifically the controls. More on Resident Evil 4 in a month or so when that review comes out, but Prime, let's shooting take a back seat in a brave way almost no other first-person shooter does. The GameCube controller has a second stick. Halo launched a year prior. Retro knew what they were doing here by making this conscious decision. They de-emphasized aiming for combat, which is focused more on strafing, dodging, and using your equipment. And it's honestly really weird to think this Z-targeting mechanic hardly makes it into any other first-person game. Prime puts exploration and platforming front and center, and de-emphasizes aiming at certain areas in favor of platforming and avoidance, which is weird because Resident Evil 4 features tank controls and does this the exact opposite way by using those tank controls but restricting movement and emphasizing aiming at certain areas. Very interesting. And I get that every first-person shooter game you have ever played has used two sticks, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one stick is bad. Once you get used to it, it's fine. Honestly, in a weird twist, someone who has never played games before could probably pick up Prime's original controls faster than the two-stick control method. So I was skeptical, but the dual-stick controls felt right at home. Well, mostly. So there is something refreshing about being able to look freely and not firmly plant your feet on the ground to tilt up a simple 10 degrees, but there are a few recommendations I have going forward, assuming Retro keeps this control method. First, in the original controls, where you cannot freely look while jumping, Retro smartly has Samus automatically look down slightly while jumping. This allows for easier platforming, and it's removed on the dual-stick version, but I don't think it would have hurt to have kept it. And while we're on platforming, grabbing ledges, Doom or Halo style, or, 2D Metroid just seems like a no-brainer. And my next major considering for the actual controls of the game are the charge shots. I guess this is somewhat rectified by allowing a face button or the ZR button to shoot, but as someone who grew up with the face button shooting, Having my thumb holding down the charge shot made it impossible to aim with that right stick, and then switching to the ZR method for those scenarios made it very hard to shoot super missiles. And before I would do something, my brain would have to decide, which button do I want to use to accomplish the same goal, that is allowing a charge shot? Do I need to use my thumb, or do I need to use my index finger because I need to freely aim or shoot a super missile respectively? And when you have to do both, then it's hell in a handbasket. It's a weird problem, and my ultimate solution is once the charge shot is charged, you can then release your finger and tap it again to fire. And my final major consideration for shifting the controls of Metroid Prime is the targeting system. I remember this was one of the few critiques of the original release. Sometimes it's hard to lock on to that one thing you need to lock onto when there's a lot to lock onto on the screen. And I think you could very easily implement the Soulsborne lock-on system where you lock onto something and then you tap the right stick in a direction to lock onto the next thing closest. In the event that you do miss your mark, you can easily fix it, and more importantly, more complicated combat scenarios can be introduced. More enemies can be doing more things, and the player will have the tools to bounce between those different enemies. But that's, I think, enough on the controls. I think that's the longest I've spent talking about button placement and alternatives in any of my videos. So let's move on and talk about the map itself. The map and its design. And the most common complaint I've heard on the map design itself is Magmoor Caverns, with the main criticism being that it's just a subway that you're forced through. And for example, if you were at location A and you need to get to C, chances are you'll need to stop at B, which is Magmoor Caverns, to get there. But here's the thing, that's kind of what I love about Magmoor Caverns. It's refreshing in a maze. It's a straight line. Where the rest of Prime's map gets to be ridiculous in branching pathways, circling back to areas, and general complexity, if I need to get somewhere, I can pop into Magmoor Caverns and from there emerge into any zone on the map. I feel like without Magmoor Caverns, navigating the map would be an absolute nightmare. And a lot of other critiques of the area revolve around the number of revisits for no items, but a lot of those criticisms take into account a perfect run, which I and most people will certainly not be doing. Like, for the average person, they're going to be going to every location a lot more than is absolutely necessary. And lastly on Magmoor, is because it's a straight line and because it's frequently visited, Retro layered the navigation through the area, so you get to take advantage of your new abilities in each return. So return trips become quicker, and the player sees a tangible improvement in the hard work they're putting in. And with a game designed from the ground up with more powerful hardware than the GameCube, maybe we can eliminate or reduce those elevators, or make them like how they were in the mines, where they're happening in real time and not a load screen. I feel like it would allow for more FromSoft map design where you hit these eureka moments when you find out how one area connects to another. As it currently stands, you take an elevator from Lava World magically into Ice World. And the only other thing I have to say about the actual design of the map I want to discuss are the rooms that really got me. Like this lava room, or this room where you get the morph ball. You remember this room because there was an event which led to a power-up. You then notice the half pipe, so you remember to come back. You come back and use the boost ball, only to then realize you need the spider ball, and there's several rooms which require multiple power-ups that keep you coming back to them. And this really keeps rooms solidly in your brain, and you really want to finally see what's on the other side of the door just out of reach. I think adding more of these could be nice. Now, as far as the actual map goes, there are only two major recommendations. The first is fairly obvious to me, which is just to be able to mark up your map. I think Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild are good examples. Just be able to drop some markers down. Nothing too crazy. And the second system is the hint system I would rework a bit. Honestly, I don't mind hints, especially when I was a kid playing this game, but what I did mind was that I was forced to see the hints if the hint system was turned on. I think Retro could easily just have a hint machine at the save station or something, and maybe even have levels of hints to be offered. But forcing me to take the hint after playing for a while is Kinda weird. Maybe I just want to explore, look for missile expansions, or just scan stuff retro. Let me just have some fun. Okay, now, a few thoughts on the combat. We talked earlier about how Retro put the focus of the first-person combat on dodging and equipment over fine-tuned aiming, which I think is not only fine, but somehow it's still refreshing in 2023. I'm just not crazy about how they decided to implement that equipment use. For the most part, the game devolves into shoot this color enemy with this color beam, and I just think there could be so much more. I'm thinking like Horizon Zero Dawn, where enemies have multiple parts with different weaknesses, and sure, you can brute force them with your default shooter early on, but maybe the plasma beam you can shoot off the chest armor, the ice beam can freeze the jetpacks, and Samus can mix and match beam use per enemy. At the very least, let's get a bit more creative than just simple color matching. And I try not to watch reviews before writing my own, but a few caught my eyes, mostly because this is a 1-to-1 remake and I've already seen a million reviews of Metroid Prime, and several outlets were critical of the punishing save system. And I'm gonna defend that save system. Basically, when you die, you go back to your last save. Save systems are few and far between. I remember playing this game in 2002 and thinking the punishment for death could set you back pretty far. And I don't feel like this is a relic of the past. It felt intentional then, and I think it still belongs now. If you die in Prime, you go back to your last manual save, with save stations few and far between, and I think that heightens the dread. And when you are in Magmore Caverns with 50 health on your last energy tank and your visor is fogging and Samus is breathing heavily, there's some tension right there. Some serious tension. And the consequences of lost progress really add some weight to the isolation in the alien world. And let's not forget, Metroid Dread was no walk in the park, so I actually quite like challenging Metroid. Where I think Prime could borrow from Dread is beam-specific doors being automatic, but if beam-specific doors are being kept, they could subtly hint at which item you might need for the next room instead of strictly being progress checks. And I think Dread did a better job at making early game areas more challenging later on. In Prime, it's pretty easy to damage tank early areas. Retro does try introducing new and harder enemies, but new enemies are already easy by the time they're introduced, and the consistently introduced enemies, the Chozo Spirits, are easily the worst enemy in the game, and honestly the worst enemy in recent games that I've played. If only because they drive the incredible vibes of the official soundtrack to a screeching halt. Now, I have 3 last bits and bobs to talk about. This kind of exists because I was able to get the super missile before the charge shot. I think there should be less linearity to the upgrade path, which I know is insanely hard to pull off, and I'm not necessarily talking about sequence breaks. I'm talking more like Gen 1 Pokemon, where nothing really stops you from doing 3 gyms out of order. Not all of the gyms, but there is a spot where there's less linearity. Maybe it could be explicitly presented in a cutscene, or maybe it could be more secret. And the whole game doesn't have to do this, but maybe one part could be kind of fun. And next I want to talk about scanning briefly, because I honestly don't have a good answer for this one, but I still feel like it's worth talking about in 2023. I just know that scanning can feel like a pace breaker and grind the game to a halt, and I felt bad doing so much scanning while capturing the gameplay for this review. But I think the idea of scanning is cool. However, I think having it voiced, even by an AI voice, would ruin the isolation aspect. So I'm not sure what needs to be done with scanning, but I feel like there's room for improvement for Prime 4, where scanning is less interruptive to the gameplay. Speaking of things grinding to a halt, let's talk about that endgame final quest. In Prime, to get to the final boss, 12 artifacts need to be collected throughout the world map, many of which require late-game items to recover. And Nintendo really liked these in the GameCube era with games like Prime and Wind Waker, which is weird because GameCube sits in this golden position where there wasn't as much of an incentive to pad out game length. Arcade games, they needed to eat quarters. Up to Nintendo 64, those were padded so you couldn't beat them in a rental period, and more recently we have live service, subscription service, and microtransaction hell games which pad out lengths for obvious reasons. But Rentals were kind of on their way out in the GameCube era, so I'm not sure why Nintendo were pushing these end quests if they were at all. Either way, it's fairly clear that Retro likes them, because they did it again in Prime 2. They did something similar in Prime 3, and so we might just be seeing it in Prime 4. My biggest complaint is, much like Wind Waker, it can be a colossal waste of time if the player is not adequately prepared by the game or by a guide. The obvious solution many critics have suggested is making more of the items accessible from earlier points in the game. And I 100% agree. I would also add that it should be abundantly clear how many artifacts are in each zone, because the time loss really comes from bouncing around all the zones, finding one artifact at a time. It's remarkable how well Metroid Prime holds up today. The GameCube version, frankly, still shines. Even on a 2015 smartphone chip, the remaster holds its own in visual standards to modern games. And with a few minor tweaks to controls, Prime still stands toe-to-toe with the best FPS games out there. And what's crazier is there really isn't anything else like it still. Playing Prime Remastered made me realize just how much I missed 3D Metroid, and more than ever, I cannot wait to see what Retro Studios has in store for us with Metroid Prime 4.